over the last 2-3 weeks, we're seeing an awful lot of key concerns, if you like, for employers that are developing as a consequence of furlough. So we're going to look at these for the next 10-15 minutes or so, and then we'll move into the Q&A. But certain of the key concerns: can we rotate employees in furlough? So I've dealt with that a little. Yes, you can, but you have to safeguard that minimum period for each period of furlough, which is 3 consecutive weeks. You can take employees off furlough and then redesignate them as furloughed again on a 3-weekly or 4-weekly or 5-weekly basis, but no less than 3 weeks. If you breach that 3-week period, then you've got to do it, because commercially it's necessary for the business. Because if you bring them back before 3 weeks is up, you forego the 80% to £2,500 contribution by the government. The furlough scheme has had a number of updates, but that has never changed. So be crystal clear about that 3-week consecutive period as a minimum. What do you do if an employee refuses to be placed on furlough? Well, that's an unusual one, but it does happen. And what do we actually do with that? So if an employee refuses to be placed on furlough, then the employer, in principle, in the extreme short term, keeps them on full pay and has them covering their role, responsibilities and duties as best they possibly can, whether that's working from home or social distancing as best as possible within the workplace. But given that the vast majority of employees are going into furlough, are only doing so because were they not furloughed, then they would be facing the prospect of compulsory redundancy or layoff. Then it's an extremely short-term gain by the employee, and probably followed up by a layoff period and then compulsory redundancy. So once that is explained to employees, I suspect most will not refuse to be placed on furlough. It's much more the other way around. A lot of employees are coming and saying, I'd like to be furloughed. I think I should be furloughed. I'm, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not a key worker. This is not an essential business. Can we all be furloughed, please? We're seeing a lot of those queries, and they're easier to deal with in a sense. But where an employee refuses to be placed on furlough, I suspect it's more to do with a lack of good comms. So we need to make sure that our communications to all our colleagues are really helpful and clear. What about employees on unpaid leave, sick leave, self-isolating or shielding? So a couple of things in that. Anybody who's in long-term sickness absence, for example, that is a category of leave and pay, and that doesn't change. So it's a bit like what I said in relation to maternity. The maternity category or categorization of the employee does not change simply because of furloughing and this job retention scheme. Even if it were because of someone coming back from unpaid leave, someone coming back from long-term sickness absence, etc., they are coming back in principle to the job that they previously would have done, and then they are to be furloughed. So even if they seek to change their categorization, then they need to be issued with a letter which explains how this furloughing scheme works. They have to give express written consent to that, and then they go out and furlough. You cannot backdate some of those individuals' pay through a period of sickness absence, i.e. back to the 1st of March as furlough, because it isn't. They have been out on a different categorization of leave, and that does not change. Anybody who is on sick leave or self-isolating for themselves are eligible for SSP, not furlough. If you're out for the 2-week period of SSP, that is what you get paid. If the business wants to top it up because of discretionary sick pay, they can. It's not furlough. Once they return from SSP or that 12-day period, then they can be furloughed, again, subject to consent. The one other area, however, is the employees who are shielding or shielded, because they can be placed on furlough. That is in line with public health guidance, which is not an employer election alone. It is generally based on the employer having received the NHS $1.5 million letters. A couple of things on that, which we'll touch on again. The BMA, the British Medical Association, has confirmed that they anticipate a second round of those kind of letters. Two things in that: there's not going to be as many of them, and two, the GP practices, or the majority of GP practices in GB and NI, already have the precedent comms for that, and they also have the very specific training and the guidance as to whether those should be released or not. So again, for an employer, we want to see the original NHS letter which confirms shielded or shielding status, or B, we want to wait to see the second round of those formal letters issued in tandem with British Medical Association and public health guidance. Unless you have both, or one or the other rather, of those letters, then actually it's a hard stance to take, but you don't necessarily accept that the individual can be placed on furlough, principally because of that, unless you're, as a business, you're furloughing in any event. So my second point there about employees and maternity, paternity, adoption, or shared parental leave, the normal rules and all those schemes apply, and the categorization of those payments and types of leave will continue to apply. So if we go to the next slide, then some other questions, we can canter through some of these. What if 80% of wages is below national minimum wage? That is fine. National minimum wage only applies for hours worked for employees furloughed. They are not working, therefore national minimum wage doesn't apply. So the furloughing can be less than the national minimum wage. One distinction in that is in relation to apprentices. So apprentices can continue to do certain functions whilst they are furloughed. They can continue to do study leave, exams, etc. Some of their basic qualifications which can be done remotely, that is permissible as long as it's within the apprenticeship scheme. And because of that, even if furloughed, then they should still not be paid less than the minimum apprenticeship minimum wage, or the national minimum wage is appropriate. So payroll administrators will need to bear that in mind when we come through the various applications. Can an employee take up a second job during furlough? Yes, they absolutely can. If you may want to check that out or get permission from your contract of employment so that they don't go and work for a competitor, for example. But yes, they can take up another role whilst furloughed. They can also be furloughed twice. They can be furloughed if they have two part-time jobs. They can be furloughed from both and then go and pick up another job temporary through supermarkets or NHS volunteering, for example. So yes, employees can take up second or third jobs. And can employees volunteer, undertake training? Yes, absolutely, and I've set that out. Certain training within the business, but let's not be cute about that. Certain of our clients certainly have tried to dilute or develop the notion of training and what does that actually look like, and training on the job and doing certain things in the office. That's not right. If that is generating revenue for or providing services to the business, then that is work, and that is in breach of the furlough scheme. So we need to be crystal clear about what we do and don't do so as not to jeopardize recovery of these monies. So what about self-employed consultants? Again, we've touched on that. Other service workers, they need to be on the PAYE system. If they have not been on the PAYE system, employers should not seek to force them in. It is not the right thing to do unless the employer is prepared to take the hit for the 80% up to 2.5k, because you will not recover it from HMRC under the government gateway. And even if you do, you'll be running the risk for the next 5 years that the HMRC investigators retrospectively assess and then seek to recover and penalise. A truly self-employed individual consultant can access the self-employment income support scheme. It would be wrong for employers to seek to try and do that out of the goodness of our hearts. It may be sympathetic to seek to try and do that, but you can, of course. But if you do that, you carry total risk that HMRC will not agree with you. What about annual leave then? So this is the big one, about how does it accrue during furlough, and can employees be required to use it up? So quite a bit of guidance in that now, which was really, really helpful, because initially it seemed that you weren't able to take any annual leave whilst on furlough, but that is now gone. So you can take annual leave during furlough, and certainly you continue to accrue it. You don't accrue it at a rate of 80%, you accrue it at a rate of 100% under contract. and that's another thing to bear in mind, the government furloughing scheme is a contribution to salary. It is not a reduction in salary. It is not unilaterally reducing the amount that the individual is paid. It is just a contribution level. So in the same way holiday leave continues to accrue under contract, and the HMRC has also now confirmed that employees can elect to take holiday while in furlough and will receive their usual holiday pay, i.e. they will receive 100% of their holiday pay under contract in accordance with the working time regs. And where we say working time regs, we really mean as a consequence of BEAR Scotland and that whole chain of case law which illustrated what calculation an employer should use when calculating holiday pay. It is also possible for employers to require that an employee takes holiday at a certain time, as long as it gives the notice required under the working time regs. So if you want the employee to take 2 weeks leave, you give, for the sake of argument, a minimum of 2 weeks notice. Under your own contract of employment, it's probably stipulated exactly what you can do and not do in relation to holiday pay. So in a sense, all you really need to know is that in principle, you can require that an employee takes holiday during furlough. But the government has issued this guidance blind to what you have actually agreed in your contract of employment. Employment law hasn't fallen away, so check your employment contract first. If there's a trade union recognised, check the collective agreement. If there's no trade union but there's an employee representative group and there's some form of collective agreement there, check it. See what you can say or do in relation to holiday leave. Look at your contract of employment, overridden by your, or augmented rather, by your handbook or intranet. See what it says about holiday leave and then apply it. And if you can't force the employee to take it, equally, employers are really concerned about employees building up a huge bank of accrued annual leave and then wanting to take it as soon as lockdown is over, so that whenever you're desperately needing people back into the workplace to actually kick off and run, you're then dealt with the vast majority of the workforce all wanting to take annual leave at the same time. Well, that is a risk, but it's only a risk if you are silent on it. Employees will always need to request when they take annual leave in any event, so that needs to be coordinated. Some leave requests will be turned down, but also employees should be reminded, as we say at the bottom of this note, that the UK regs in this have also been introduced as a consequence of furlough to permit up to 4 weeks unused annual leave to be carried forward into the next 2 leave years, i.e. even if the employer says no to certain leave in calendar year 2020, the employee doesn't lose that benefit. They will carry it forward and they can use it in 2021, 2022. So that is the government's way of seeking to ease the potential impact of the workforce if the employer does not seek to require an employee take it during furlough or otherwise actively manage it. But the good news for employers is that you can, you just need to be pretty clear in your communications and be fair and reasonable in how you apply that, etc. So what happens when the government ends the scheme? Well, this is really difficult one for us, because the scheme, one would hope, will continue until such time as lockdown finishes, or at least we begin to transition out of lockdown and back to work, so that the economy and the markets all begin to turn again, so that our underlying businesses can survive. And it's as blunt as that. And unfortunately, if we know that the scheme is ending, say it ends at the end of June or the end of July, but our markets haven't recovered and our business is still in financial difficulty, well then the business will need to consider compulsory redundancy, and all the normal redundancy protocols continue to apply. Whether it is a collective redundancy of 20 or more employees or not, there will need to be a period of notification, consultation, decision making, matrix selection if needs be, appeals, and again all the considerations of suitable alternatives to compulsory redundancy. But all those responsibilities still lie with the employer, and the really hard question for the employer is, do you begin to issue those notices and run that consultation while furlough is continuing knowing that it ends in 2, 3, 4 weeks time? Or do you wait until furlough ends and then issue the notice and say, actually, guys, you know, our business is not picking up, we're really sorry, we have to make compulsory redundancies then? So that's a real tough one. And that's why I say you may wish to start, you may have no choice but to really start your redundancy consultation in advance of the scheme ending, particularly if the collective consultation, i.e. 20 or more employees, is triggered. And I'll touch very briefly on the coronavirus self-employment income support scheme. And this is more a signpost element. If the employee, casual worker, contract worker, etc., is on your PAYE system, then we go through furlough, government gateway. If they are not, but they come and say to you, look, I want to be furloughed, I think I should be furloughed, etc., their pathway is this into the self-employment income support scheme. Similar principles. Grants will be based on 80% of average profits in the last 3 years, subject to a cap of £2,500 per month, etc. So if that applies, you can work it through. I'm not going to spend any more time on that now. The guidance is out there.